Oh, there it was earlier. I shut that in. Okay, good afternoon, guys. Thanks for joining us on your lunch break. I'm Shawna Keene. We're with the State Department Special Ed Services. We took the IEP and kind of have chopped it up into pieces for you guys, and today we will be talking about accommodations. You can find this PowerPoint and the links to the video under the State tab in EdPlan. This one will be posted either tomorrow or later this afternoon, but all the other ones are there. If you've missed some before or want to go back and watch them, you're more than welcome. As we talk about accommodations, they may be needed for students with disabilities served on an IEP or Section 504. The provision of accommodations can be afforded to students in a variety of ways, and we'll discuss that. As we go through today, our objectives, we're going to do an introduction to accommodations, accommodation categories, what is a modification, talk briefly about the accommodation selection, evaluating the accommodation effectiveness, and ideas to try. We first want to start with the definition. An accommodation, of course we know, are changes in how a student accesses information and demonstrates learning. We also want to remember that accommodations do not change the instructional level, content, or performance criteria. The changes are made in order to provide a student with equal access to learning and an equal opportunity to show what he or she knows and can do. I use this example a lot. I see accommodations as eyeglasses. Some of us have to wear them, some do not. For those who have to wear them, we don't change what we read if we're reading a newspaper. We don't get special newspapers. We don't get newspapers that are cut in half. We all get the same newspaper. But for me to read it successful, I need my eyeglasses or I can't read them. It doesn't mean that I can't or I need help. It just means I need my eyeglasses to help me with seeing the newspaper, where some of us do not. So it doesn't change the level. It doesn't change the content or performance criteria. It just means I need glasses to help me see what the newspaper is saying. A purpose of an accommodation is to provide the necessary supports to address the student's disability. Accommodations provide access to grade level curriculum. And I know what you're saying, but Johnny is in 8th grade and he reads on the 1st grade level. So unfortunately, I know that, but Johnny has to be tested on the 8th grade level. So we have to put accommodations in place to make sure that Johnny is getting what he needs to be on the 8th grade level, even though he's reading on the 1st grade level. As far as equality and equity, if we judge our students, as you can see, this teacher has all of his students, and it says for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb the tree. Is that very fair to our Mr. Fish and Seal? No. Would they fail at climbing a tree? Absolutely. Fair does not mean treating every student exactly the same. Fair means providing each student with what the student needs to have a chance to succeed. Accommodations are practices and procedures that provide equitable access during instruction and assessment for students with disabilities. It is intended to reduce or even eliminate the effects of a student's disability. Once again, we do not want to reduce the learning expectations of our students on an IEP, and they must be consistent across classroom instruction, classroom assessments, district-wide assessments, and statewide assessments. The framework This may be a good slide to go over with your gen ed population. Not that I'm picking on gen ed teachers. I love them. I've just never been a gen ed teacher. And I know that sometimes this is where they get. So to me, if we as special ed teachers show them this, that we never want to lower our expectations for our SPED students. We want to set high expectations for students with disabilities. We want them to achieve grade level academic content standards. We understand that if they have a learning disability, that it may be a struggle for them. That's why we use accommodations. We want to learn about the accommodations for instruction and assessments. Talk to your gen ed population. What are some accommodations that you're struggling with having to do for your students? Make sure to select appropriate accommodations for instruction and assessments for individual students. Don't get into a habit of clicking every accommodation for every one of your students. That's not what we want. We want to make sure you're looking at each student individual and what their needs are to be successful. Frequently administer accommodations during instruction and assessment. Don't just give them an accommodation for a test and that's it. That can be very confusing for students and for gen ed teachers as well. You want to make sure you're effectively administrating them both in the instruction part as well as the assessment part. And you want to make sure you evaluate the effectiveness of accommodations. Please, please, please have conversations with other people on the team. If an accommodation is not working, it's not effective, take it off the IEP. You don't have to just leave it on there just because he's had it since kindergarten. Remove it, have a meeting with everyone, do an addendum if needed, or when the IEP comes due, you may want to sit down and meet with everyone and discuss this accommodation is not working, we need to remove it from the IEP. Don't just remove them from the IEP though. Make sure you're having those meetings, having those conversations. Accommodation categories, we usually see 4 categories: setting, timing and scheduling, response, and presentation. A student may need 1 of each, 2 of each. They may need more than 1 in each of these. It just really depends on the student and his or her needs. What is the setting accommodation? The setting accommodation changes the location or the conditions of the setting in which a student receives instruction and participates in an assessment. Students may be allowed to sit in a different location than the majority of the students to reduce distractions, increase access to assistive technology. We also see preferential seating. Yes, I got that word right. I've been practicing. We see this a lot, but people aren't specific on that. They just say preferential seating. That's it. But what does that mean? Does Johnny need to sit by the teacher, back of the room, facing the wall? I am the type of person, I need to be the outskirts of a meeting. I cannot be in the center, or I will wiggle and twist and cause lots of distraction. You see that also with students maybe who are ADHD, so they may need to sit along the walls or on the outskirts of a row. But you want to make sure you're being specific on an IEP. Don't just put preferential seating, because people may not know exactly what you mean by that. Does that mean he gets to sit where he chooses every time he walks into a classroom? No. It means he needs to be at the back of the room or by the door. Timing and scheduling. Those accommodations change the allowable length of time or needed breaks to complete assignments, assessments, or activities. Timing accommodations may also change the way the time is organized. I use this a lot if you have a student with who takes medication. Sometimes we know in the late afternoons the medication starts wearing off, so we probably don't want to put his hardest classes in the late afternoon. Maybe if he has very hard tests, semester tests, things like that, we want to make sure to schedule them in the morning, maybe right after lunch. Once again, whatever you find works for a student, make sure you're being specific on the IEP about that, and everyone understands. Also, it may change to include a particular time assignment can be done or turned in by the end of the week. By next day, he gets 5 other days to do it. Just be very mindful when you're picking this and be talking to your gen ed teachers. You don't want to put that he gets extra time and be open-ended like that. Some middle school and high school teachers may be a little sassy because they have to have their grades in by a certain time as well. So you want to be having those conversations. If you put in there Johnny needs extra time, maybe he needs 2 extra days. Be very, very specific and have an end date so they know, not just he gets till whenever he turns it in, the end of the year. A particular student is very slow at completing assignments. The student is capable of completing the assignment, but he can't keep up with the pace of the other students, so he gets additional time. The team needs to meet and establish how much time is sufficient for the student to finish his work. And please make sure for your middle school and high school students, the student knows how much time they have. They don't have 5 weeks. They have maybe the end of the week or every Friday to turn in their work. Make sure the parent understands that and the gen ed teacher all are understanding exactly what you mean by additional days. Response is another one. Accommodation allows the students to complete assignments, tests, and activities in different ways, or to solve organized problems using assistive technology. Some of our students struggle with reading, so maybe they write their sentences on the computer, type it, or iPad. Maybe they use a scribe. I had a student who would have a fit and freak out anytime the paper was erased because to him it was broken. So when during big test, I had the para set with him. He had a copy of the test and he had ABC D tiles, and he would read the question and then choose the tile. The para would circle it and then hand it in. Was it a little more time consuming? Yes. Did we have to schedule the test and the gen ed teachers? Yes. But it helped him be more successful, and it cut down on his fit throwing, and we got through some things. So in the end, it was worth it. Presentation. Accommodation provides students to access instruction and assessments in different formats other than reading standard print. Some alternatives could be auditory, tactile, visual, a combination of both. Maybe if you have a student who struggles with reading comprehension, or he may read the book, then you let him read or listen to the book on tape, then maybe he needs to follow along with the book on tape as they're reading it and he's following along. These are all things that can be put in the IEP that are very specific, that can help the student be successful. Also, if you have a student with visual impairments, maybe small print is difficult, so we may need to magnify it. If you have a student who struggles with maybe his eyes get tired looking at white paper and white lights, so we might want to do his assignments on blue paper, pink paper, things like that. Make sure you're having conversations with the gen ed teacher and the principal in the IEP meeting so everyone understands exactly what is their role in this accommodation, who's going to be in charge of making sure he gets those prints or gets the auditory book or auto books. All these things need to be talked about in the IEP meeting. When we're talking about accommodations versus modifications, a lot of people, think these are interchangeable, and they are not. The biggest distinction is the question, are learning expectations or access to the grade level lowered. Our accommodations, once again, remember we do not want to reduce the learning expectations, but provide a student with access to the general curriculum. The modification, though, changes and lowers or even reduces the learning expectations. In addition, they increase the gap between achievement of the students with disabilities and expectations for proficiency at grade level. What I mean by that is, yes, we know our friend Johnny reads on an 8th grade level, or is in the 8th grade. He reads on a 1st grade level. If I only always give him 1st grade work, how will I close that gap? So we have to be mindful and find the right combination to help support Johnny in the 8th grade classroom while he reads on a 1st grade level, and how are we going to close that gap for him? Instead of making it bigger or continuing to make the gap wider, we don't want to do that. And remember that only a small population of our students should be having modifications. That's more for your student maybe in multi-classroom or severe profound, students on the OAP possibly. I'm not saying every student on the OAP needs modifications. Absolutely not. It's really based on that student and what they need to be successful. Because the modification, it changes in what a student is expected to learn. The changes are made to provide a student with opportunities to participate in the classroom instead of actually doing the classroom work. So just be mindful of that when you're writing your IEPs on your students and talking to the team which one would be better for that student. Examples of modifications: reduces the assignments and assessments, so a student only needs to complete the easiest problem. Once again, remember, we want to set high expectations for our students. And I know I was a special ed teacher. To me, I didn't want my kiddos to fail. But then I had to remember they're going to be in the real world. They're going to be in high school, and we want to prepare them for that. We want to be very, very careful about revising assignments to make them much easier. If you cross out half all the time and they only have a 50-50 shot, are they really understanding what you're asking them, or are they getting good at guessing? So be mindful of that. I'm not saying you don't ever choose it. I'm just saying pay attention to which students need this modification and which do not. Giving a student hints or clues or to correct responses on assignments. We want to be very careful for this. We know in life, nobody gives me hints. I wanted to win the lotto, and I did not last night because nobody gave me hints or clues on to which one's the real numbers. So you want to be mindful. Our kiddos are going to be out in the real world one day, and we want to prepare them for that. Now, having said that, I'm not saying you set them all up for failure. You just have to find the correct balance for each student on your caseload. Modification Summary. Modifications change the learning expectation. Only a small percent of our special ed population should be using modifications, and be very, very selective when you use modifications for students to ensure that the grade level content is not compromised. When you're selecting your accommodations during your IEP meeting or you're developing the IEP, you want to make sure you have conversations with your gen ed population and your students, all of their gen ed teachers, if they have more than one. The following questions should be considered. What are the students' learning strengths? Sometimes we forget about that. Johnny may be very good at one thing, so we want to make sure we use those strengths for him. What is the student's needs? If Johnny's struggling in reading, how will that affect his math? Well, he'll struggle with reading math problems or doing science and social studies. So you want to make sure you're having those conversations. How do the students' learning needs affect the achievement of the grade level content standards? Well, Johnny reads on, he's in 8th grade. We're reading on the 1st grade level, so what are we going to have to do to make sure we get the achievement of his grade level standards? We kind of have to meet in the middle. Maybe we have someone test our note-taking for him. That way he can listen and then read the notes later instead of having to do both. These are some things you have to have when you're developing the IEP. What specialized instruction does the student need to achieve grade level content standards? What that means is he in direct instruction? Is he in a co-taught class? Is he in a monitoring? Those are all things you need to talk about with your team when we're choosing accommodations. I love this for my sports fans. You want to practice how you play. Coaches teach their kiddos that during practice we're going to practice exactly how we're going to play the game. Same thing with accommodations. Don't tell me you want an accommodation on the state test just in case he might need it one day. No. If he needs it on the state test, then we need to be practicing it throughout the school year. That way he knows how to use it, and the gen ed teachers know how to use it, and everyone is comfortable. That way, during the state test, he's ready to go. He's ready to play. He's ready to give his best instead of trying to figure out what this accommodation is. You just now decided he needed it. Also, we want to make sure all students are different. An IEP, individualized education, remember that. I had a lady tell me that, oh, I give these accommodations for everyone on my caseload, whether they need it or not. No, you don't. I want you to start looking at each student and don't put accommodations on there if they don't need it. Or just say, I give this to everyone. No. I want you to start looking at each student. If they don't need it, don't put it on the IEP. An accommodation that works for one student will not necessarily work for another with the same need. Or we get this, I don't know why this accommodation is chosen. He's had it since pre-K. Well, Johnny's in 8th grade now, so he may not need some of his pre-K accommodations. And he may. If he does, then leave them on there, absolutely. In EdPlan, these are what our accommodations look like. This is what I was talking about being very specific. On the other tab in EdPlan, you can choose this, and you can be very, very, very specific with what you need. Johnny likes to sit at the back of the class by the door. Now, once again, remember, on this state test, we have specific accommodations we can choose from. In the classroom, you can go above and beyond, but if you're practicing it in the classroom daily and it's making him successful, then yes, you want to look at adding it to the state test if it is an accommodation that is allowable. Accommodation considerations, which accommodations are going to be used regularly in the classroom or just for test. You want to have this conversation with the gen ed teachers. Sometimes they don't understand. Okay, do you want me to do it for every test? Just the hard test? Do you want me to do it for every assignment or just these assignments? Make sure you're talking to your gen ed teachers about that. The accommodation effectiveness. Have conversations with your students. Do you like this accommodation? Is it helping you? Is it embarrassing you? They will tell you whether or not they want to use it or not. And be willing to listen to what they have to say. And I know sometimes parents want every accommodation, and that's when you have to have a conversation with them, just like I'm having with you guys. We don't want to over-accommodate. We want to prepare them for real life. We want to make sure they are successful, but we want to make sure they're doing things with as much independency as they can. So just have those conversations with the parents. When we're implementing the accommodations, we want to monitor and make sure they're effective. If they are not, then have a IEP meeting and take them off if they're not effective. If they are effective, make sure you make a note. Okay, you know what? These are working. I've got to remember that. So when he changes grades, I can let them know. You also, if you find an accommodation that's working great for a student, teach them to self-advocate for themselves. And in the community, in church, at home, as they get older, post-secondary, even at work, teach them to use those self-advocacy skills to tell them, this is the accommodation that works for me. This is what makes is more helpful when I'm doing my job. These are just some examples, breaking down assignments, reduce homework assignments. Maybe Johnny gets to choose every other one, or he gets to mark out 5 of the hardest problems he doesn't like, but he still has to do 3 of the hard ones. Is it easy? No. Does it make grading sometimes a nightmare? Absolutely. But if it's worth it for the student and that's what they need, then we can, as teachers, roll with it. And these are just some ideas. I'm running out of time, so I'm kind of flipping through the slides. Kristen and I will be doing a longer presentation on accommodations in November. I think it's November 6th, 7th, and 8th in Sayre, Woodward, and Weatherford. If you want to come to one of those trainings, you're more than welcome. Just go to Eventbrite and type in OSDE accommodation training, and you can find it and sign up to which one you're going to. I also will be uploading this to EdPlan later this afternoon or in the morning under the state tab, so you will have it. These are just some more ideas of an accommodation. Sometimes we get bogged down on just the academics, but we could have some for social skills. Maybe Johnny needs a picture sequence example when he's doing something hard, so he won't forget all the steps. Maybe we need a break card for Johnny when he's getting overwhelmed. First and then cards are great. Maybe he needs a visual schedule so he knows exactly what's coming next. In conclusion, accommodations are chosen for the individual student and should be specifically geared towards his or her needs. If an accommodation is chosen for a test, it needs to be used daily in the classroom. Do not over-accommodate. It's not the amount of accommodations you choose, it's the quality of the accommodations you choose. As always, the assessment office has a manual on state-approved assessment accommodations. If you are in a teaching grade, I highly recommend you download this and become aware of it so you know exactly what accommodations you can do. And there's my bird. If you have any other further questions, please feel free to call us. Here's our main line. If you call this number, one of our AAs will direct you to the right person to ask your questions. Depending on your questions, we kind of all have specialties. So feel free to access and call that number. I think I have 1 minute-ish. If you have any other quick questions, I will try to answer. And we'll see. Other than that, have a fabulous afternoon, and we'll see you November 7th. I don't know. The next, I don't remember. You can get on our website and find out when all the our webinars are, and then sign up for them. I think it's November 7th.
I think that's right, but I hate.
Because I think I'm going to be gone, that's why.
Okay.
But don't take my word for it. Okay, with that, since there's no further questions, you guys have a great day.